Hi. Hello. It's Pride Month, and I truly hope that your social media feeds have been as populated as mine, with posts about positivity and courage and joy and support and love, and of course, pride. Um, when I thought about contributing some kind of message from my own perspective, I briefly caught myself trying to talk myself out of it because I had a niggling doubt that my experience wasn't valid, or I should have really used two air quotes there, that it wasn't valid enough for whatever reason, because it wasn't queer enough. And then I thought, oh, okay, what's going on there? If that's something that I feel, then maybe that's something that other people are feeling too, and therefore worthy of discussion. So, while on the one hand, I fear that this might be considered self-indulgent or attention-seeking, people are murdered and assaulted and bullied and harassed and isolated and subjected to all kinds of cruelty over this stuff all over the world every single day. LGBTQA plus youth are statistically more likely to become homeless and are at a higher risk of suicide. So I do feel actually like they're of a small responsibility to speak up and make myself visible and share experience in solidarity and encourage those who aren't LGBT to step up as allies. And I think that that's more important than me avoiding some twat telling me online that I'm trying to make it all about me. But I am keen to get a bit of a dialogue going, so if you have anything to add, if you've got shit to say, please do jump in. But don't be a dick. Actually, I mean, if you are going to be a dick, whenever I'm a dick, it's usually because I'm in an enormous amount of pain, either physically or more likely emotionally. So if you feel yourself about to be a dick, just check in and see what's going on there, and maybe we can talk it out. I haven't done anything like this before relating to my experience specifically, mainly because I thought that nobody would give a shit or care particularly, maybe you don't. But I figured my friends and family already know me, and then the modest platform that I have through Lounge Kittens is there because people are interested in the music, or gags, or maybe just the hair. But because I don't talk about this stuff very much, I kind of just get on with it, or occasionally allude to it sarcastically. It occurred to me that maybe my friends and family don't really know the score. And when a few super rad followers reached out to me through social media to say that they had drawn some kind of support or solidarity or strength from my feed, or from just seeing me on the stage, or just around in the world as a person, that had helped them with their own personal journeys, I was quite encouraged by that and thought maybe I should say something. As an aside, those messages that I get from LGBTQA plus people, rainbow people, it blows my mind in a way that nothing else does. Hearing that without even knowing it, I have played a small part in giving someone the beans to come out, or giving them some confidence to present themselves in a way that feels the most true to them. It's literally the most humbling and emotional sensation. It hits me right in the heart every time, and I do save every single message because one of my many beefs that I have with myself is that I don't contribute anything of any real importance in the grand scheme of things. So this feels a lot more significant to me than playing in front of thousands of people, or video views, or plays, or however else people like to judge success. I don't know. So on the off chance that this reaches just one other human at the time when they really needed to hear it, here's my personal deal, my thoughts on it. I've never really been part of a queer community, or never had a queer family. I would have liked to have done, but it just kind of never really happened. So I've kind of just been working this out on my own, with the help of a few well-placed exposures to queer pop culture at pivotal moments, like seeing the Rocky Horror Show when I was 8, and then growing up on Eddie Izzard, that tattoo video for all the things she said, and of course the now ubiquitous RuPaul's Drag Race. So I can't stress enough that I'm using words and language as it means to me and how it relates to my life. I can't and I don't or won't speak for anyone else's experiences, any other people who may be using the same words, because our definitions may vary, and in all probability our frames of reference are entirely different. So I do want to talk about language and labels and how these both help and constrain us at the same time. On the whole, I do find labels quite frustrating, but I do feel that as a jumping off point, they're pretty helpful. And I'm also going to talk about gender and sexuality. So I'm a pansexual person, but before I can really dig into what that means, I have to address my gender identity, which could be described with labels such as non-binary, gender fluid, gender flexible, gender queer. And what that means for me is that mentally I exist between the ideas of what it is to be girl and boy, as is dictated by the society and culture in which I live at this period in history. I feel like both and neither at the same time, because I reject the very idea that a person can only be one of two things. I think that humans can be fluid and flexible creatures who exist in infinite ways, with the different people in their lives and over the course of their lives and in different places, but also just at their whim. Going back to sexuality, I would never describe myself as bisexual because it implies that you are sexually attracted to two genders, only two. But there are millions of people who don't fall into one of two categories for whatever reason, and to varying degrees, including myself. So I just want to throw it out there that by being pansexual, everyone's invited to the party. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't identify as bi. If that's the hat that best fits you, then that's awesome. I did used to identify as bi when I was much younger, but that was because I didn't know there were other options, which is exactly what I mean by constraints in language, but I'll come back to that. So I wore my gender identity incredibly comfortably as a child. Then from senior school into early adulthood, I buried it and it became something of an internal struggle. While conversely, my sexuality never caused me that much turmoil. That always seemed blatantly obvious to me. And as a kid, I got branded a tomboy, which is an okay word, I suppose. I'm not hugely fond of it. I think it's the best I had at the time, and it's okay if you're kind of scrappy, I guess. But it's a difficult word to carry over into adulthood with any real dignity. I kind of find it weird to ascribe to, for instance, a woman in her 50s who is an executive and wears sharp-tailored suits and has a cropped haircut or whatever. You know, tomboy. It just seems a little bit patronising in that sense. But for ages, it was the best. It's the best we had in terms of words. But I wasn't all tomboy. I was mainly tomboy. But then if there was a party to go to, you could be sure that I would reach for the most sparkly, glittery thing I could find and throw some velvet in there too, as was very popular in the 80s and 90s. And I would adorn myself with as much costume jewellery as my tiny frame could carry, and I would trade in my trusty high tops for the highest heel and platform shoe that I would be permitted to wear at the time. So what I actually needed was a word to describe a tiny drag queen that's good at sports as well. I was always fluid. I was always both and neither, and I had shit tons of confidence, despite being a somewhat anxious and bluesy kid. Senior school was such a dark time. I was really, really excited to start senior school, but then it turned out that I was apparently one of the sad kids. Not like boohoo sad like I am now, but like uncool, dorky, and all nerdy, and the subject of much cruel mockery, which was news to me because I thought I was pretty great up until that point. But the bullying really knocked the wind out of my sails. And I was taken out of that mixed school and put in another school, which was all girls and really academic. And then I was absolutely miserable from the age of 12 to 16. So I joined late, and I'm having to make friends, but all the other groups are kind of already set. And it's all girls, so like I'm trying to fit in, I'm trying to conform, and my gender bending is just getting pushed further and further down. And everyone's hitting puberty, which is all very exciting, and everyone's becoming more womanly, except for me, because in a cruel twist of fate, I didn't go through puberty until I was almost 16. So the one time that I longed for a girly body to arrive, I just stayed small and, you know, with this boyish athletic frame, which would have suited me down to the ground were it not for the fact that I was so caught up in this brutal drama of trying not to get left behind. I had totally repressed any gay feelings that I had. Those were just pushed right down, and I remember rumours going around about who was gay. And nobody was out. This was all just gossip and speculation, and not in a way that was flattering or kind. And I couldn't even admit to myself that it might be me. And it was awful. Senior school just felt so oppressive and crushing and lonely. And I feel like every year that's gone by since I left at 16, I've been working to undo the damage that it did. And I got an absolutely banging education, but I paid a very heavy emotional tax for it. I came out as bisexual in my late teens and was told largely that it was a phase that I would grow out of, even though I'd known since I was about 3. As I mentioned before, I labelled myself bisexual through lack of vocabulary and reaching for the best fitting word available to me at the time. There was also a time much more recently where I lacked the language, concepts, experience, and so forth to understand or explain my feelings about gender identity, where I thought I might be trans. I learned that new word and what it meant to some people, and I thought, yeah, okay, like maybe. But I still wasn't fully convinced. It just felt a little like, oh, like I'm getting a little bit warmer. But at that point, I was still unable to break my programming about the binary, because what was cutting me up about it was that I was like, oh shit, do we have to choose? Because I didn't really feel like either. And I didn't feel like I was in the wrong body, particularly, although I have definitely had my ups and downs with body dysphoria. But once I had come to peace where I was mentally, the physical stuff did fall into place. Though it wasn't until my physique had changed from curvaceous and voluptuous into, more lean and relatively athletic that body and mind truly locked in. I think that a really helpful part of that process was also being intimate with people who were woke, were not only aware of my gender identity, but also interested in it and compassionate, which kind of allowed me a relaxed freedom to let go of any hang-ups that I might have had about the way I choose to be when I'm being the truest version of myself. And I think it's the difference between being with somebody that's into you despite your quirky gender identity, to being into you because they are. And actually there's something about your gender identity that they find kind of intriguing or attractive or cool. And I think it's one thing to amplify gender identity with clothes and a haircut and stuff, but when the clothes come off and what you're left with doesn't necessarily match up with where you are up here, it's really moving to be with someone who can see into your mind and understand that about you. It's incredibly liberating, and played a really big part in me letting go of any frustration and anger that I had towards my body, and building a relationship with it that was one of kindness. So earlier, when I mentioned how sometimes there's a feeling of not feeling queer enough to be invited to the rainbow party, one of the things about being pan or bi that I have gleaned through personal experience, but also from talking to pan and bi people that I know, is that sometimes, or often, or most of the time, you find yourself in relationships or trysts or marriages that are heterosexual or heterosexual passing, meaning that to the outside world, the relationship appears, for all intents and purposes, a heterosexual relationship, although it might not actually be. And I think that maybe some people might struggle to reconcile their queer identity within the context of their heterosexual relationship or a mainly hetero existence, because then it just becomes an internal thing rather than something they feel they can wear or maybe are allowed to wear externally. So for me these days, I look pretty visibly queer, I think. I wear my gender identity super comfortably, but there have been periods of years where I looked super feminine and I was in long-term heterosexual relationships, and it did feel a little bit like I had to kind of hand in my badge during that time. Like there's this slight fear of hypocrisy that comes with waving a rainbow flag and going, "Me too, guys," from the position of a visibly heterosexual relationship, like a type of imposter syndrome. And I would be really interested to hear if that resonates with anybody, or if you think that's silly. Maybe you're a queer person that's currently in a straight thing, or maybe you're a heterosexual person who's in a relationship with a queer person. And how do you feel about that? I would love to know. So I wonder whether this type of imposter syndrome is kind of tied in with the idea of minority struggle. And I don't know if I've explained that very well, but what I mean is that, like, during Pride Month, there's this huge emphasis on like queer history and on overcoming historical struggles and moving forward and striving for equality and coming out and being proud in the face of persecution and danger. And we think like the Stonewall riots, and we remember the people who were killed at the shooting at the Pulse nightclub, or the fact that homosexuality is still criminalised, like sent to prison, sometimes for life, illegal, in over 70 countries. And in 8 of those, it's punishable by death. But even in countries where same-sex marriage is available, people are still kicked out of their homes or attacked or discriminated against or harassed at work or by family, or by strangers in the street, or they're excluded from their communities. Like, there's undoubtedly an enormous amount of struggle that's still happening even in the most progressive countries. So if you're a queer person who has slipped under the gaydar for maybe all your life, and maybe you've only ever had heterosexual relationships, and maybe nothing about your personality or your appearance has ever overlapped with any of the stereotypical bullshit queer indicators, maybe the chips just fell that way for you and you've never experienced any struggle, does that mean that queer pride is less for you? Like, what makes a person's queer identity valid, and what makes it feel valid to them? Like, what if you're a super gay person, like you're 100% gay, but you go your whole life without ever having any kind of romantic involvement with another person? And I don't mean like like an asexual person. Although if there are aces out there, I would also be interested to hear where your identity sits with you in your heart, particularly at times like Pride, where we're all thinking about it a little bit more. What I guess I'm getting at is, does the gay virgin have as much entitlement to queer pride as someone who is queer but only ever experienced heterosexual relationships or trysts? Neither has had a homosexual experience, but does one have more of a place in the community than the other? So I wonder how much bigger that parade would be if everyone's sexual identity was just valid wherever it fell on the spectrum. How much support and solidarity and how many allies is the community missing out on because some people don't feel gay enough to be invited to the party, and so just kind of keep quiet and out of the way because they feel like they haven't earned their invite because they've never had the struggle, or in fact have ended up reaping the benefits of a hetero cisgender privilege their whole lives, just because that's the way it happened. So I used the word spectrum just then when talking about sexuality, and I know that some people have also used it when talking about gender, but even that as a framework I do find problematic because it's still linear. At one end you have this, and at the other end you have that, and there is a slidey scale in between the two things. And even if you had a label for every single incremental point on that scale, that's not how human beings exist at all, because there is no room for context on a lateral scale. The spectrum has no place for space and time. What I mean by that is that humans aren't plopped out on an assembly line. Every single human being has a different life experience from the moment that they're born to the moment they die. We're experiencing things that are impacting and changing the way that that we view ourselves, that we view the world, and the way that we exist within it. So maybe instead imagine the spectrum like a sphere with people pinging around inside it. So now if you tried to have a label for every single point within that sphere, it would get very, very complicated. So it's probably best just to dispense with the boundary altogether and just let the boundary be space, because that's what we're truly pinging around in. Right, that's how and where we exist. Like, there isn't really any kind of time, there isn't really a space, and when you think about it that way, all the labels kind of feel a bit insignificant. So just to bring it back in and not wanting to get too far out, certainly for me, in terms of my own queer identities, the more that I let go of labels and boundaries and definitions and rules and just existed, suspended in time and space, in whatever way felt true at the time, the more I came absolutely to peace with my gender and sexual identities. Like, I can just be Timia. That's enough. That's valid. So think of gender as being as nuanced as colour. And think how you would ever describe purple to somebody if both of you only had ever known the words for red and blue. Like, what would you do? Oh, it's like a reddy blue. It's sort of like a bluish red, but it's not. It's a completely different colour. Where would you start? But then even then, like, well, what kind of purple? Because magenta isn't the same as lilac, and lavender isn't the same as plum, or aubergine, or violet. How many different shades of blue are there already to start with? Fucking loads. And colours mix and they blend with each other. There's just like an infinite, and that's just in like our visible spectrum. It's just like, so many just tiny little differences. But this is what I mean, is it's like potentially everybody sees and experiences colour differently. And I don't just mean how, like, some people think that teal is a bluey green and some people think that it's a greeny blue. I mean that like the label is useful up until a point, but ultimately we'll never know if what we're seeing is truly the same as what everybody else is seeing, even if we're calling it the same thing. Like, we'll never know. This is what I mean by adding the context of time and space, because you can't remove the context of your life. You can't remove the context, the only context that you have from the only existence that you have known. You can't remove that from a perception, from the way that you perceive things. So, you know, just be and accept it. So I know that this is a really fiery topic that people get very passionate about and very defensive about. And the lack of compassion or desire to empathise can be upsetting, and the discrimination can be enraging, and the ignorance can be frustrating, and the hatred can be devastating. But everybody has to start somewhere in understanding this. So I would encourage people to be patient and to be kind. And I know that it's easy to feel embarrassed or uncomfortable or to feel stupid in asking or, you know, talking about this. But these conversations need to be had because there's so much at stake. People's lives are at stake, and it may be people that you know and love, maybe friends or partners or parents or children. Maybe they're at odds internally, but hoping to grow into the truest version of themselves. So I would say be patient, be kind. If you agree or you disagree with anything that I've said, or I've made you feel uncomfortable or bad about yourself or your choices, then please we can talk it out. I totally respect your right to feel differently about anything in the world to the way that I feel about it. So wherever you are currently existing in the 4D galactic spectrum, whether you're out and proud or whether you're harbouring a secret, happy Pride, take courage and be excellent to each other.